Okay, good to go.
Okay, well, we'll wait till
Yeah.
till our 10:30, so we don't miss anybody who just showed up at 10:30, and it's now 10:30. Welcome everybody to Brainstorming the Human Connection, and it's brought to you by the South Dakota Humanities Scholar. I'd like to remind everyone that this is an interactive program, and what that means is we expect you to be a part of the program. That's just why we have it, is so that people can actually ask questions, be involved in the conversation, and get clarity. It's only when we actually wrestle with ideas and put them out there and put our ideas out there that they can be considered, and we can put stress on our ideas. And when we do put stress on our ideas, they tend to strengthen, kind of like lifting weights or something like that. And this is a safe place, at least we try to make it a safe place for people to do just that. That is, put stress on their ideas or put stress on our ideas and wrestle with those ideas so that we better understand them. And that's the advantage of this kind of format. It's not just like a talk show where you get to ask a question or something like that. You get to actually interact with not only our guest and myself, but also the other people who are on the program with us. And we expect people will be in, they almost always are, very polite and considerate of the other folks' feelings and that kind of thing. But we do want to put the ideas out there and let them wrestle. We don't have to fight ourselves, just put the ideas out, and the ideas can fight and we can just be spectators, you know. So when you introduce your ideas, just expect that they will be in the ring with other ideas and they can wrestle and survive on their own, you know, based on their own merits. So getting started, we know that education is very important to the functioning of a society, especially now. It has always been, and depending on how you define education, there's not been a time in human history where it has not been important. That's how we transmit our knowledge and our experiences to those around us, and of course, the younger ones coming up. And it is that education that allows them to function reasonably well in the society that they live in. Without that education, they don't really know how to do the dance of a society. They don't know how to fit in. They don't have the tools and materials that are necessary to function and experience life in a productive way. So today we have as a guest the executive director of the South Dakota Education Equity Coalition, and it's Sarah White, and you see her there on the screen, all in her radiant glory, you know, and we are expecting to have a very interesting conversation about what they're doing and the need for such a thing. So Sarah, welcome to Brainstorming the Human Connection.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be sharing Zoom space with you all today.
Let's start off by finding a little bit out about Sarah. Who is Sarah White? Where did you come from? And how did you arrive at the position that you're in now? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I would love to. So my name is Sarah White. I am Oglala Lakota. I grew up in a small community not known to many maps called Rocky Ford, South Dakota. It's located on the northern portion of the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, in the Makoshicha, or the Badlands of the reservation. So I grew up a country girl. I'm a proud alumna representing Rocky Ford Elementary School, which is part of the Oglala Lakota County School District. and then Red Cloud High School located in Pine Ridge. So I'm a proud graduate of a reservation-based education, and like many graduates, left the res to pursue post-secondary opportunities. Envisioned a life that would be in the city for the most part of my life, found a calling in education, and then ended up back home, first as a teacher and then administrator in the Omaha Public School District before returning back to Rapid City as an administrator. And then through various efforts of trying to change the system within the system, decided that I would join the revolution for reclaiming Indigenous education outside of the education system. So in a very small nutshell, that is what led me to this moment today.
Thank you very much. I think that there's a lot to consider there, and it gives us a little bit of a framework in which we can see your efforts. Now, if you'd switch a little bit and tell us, what is the South Dakota Education Equity Coalition? What are you trying to do? What is it?
So that's a great question. We're an advocacy organization comprised of multiple cross-sector stakeholders. So we have education leaders, community members, a lot of parents, and concerned individuals who are most focused on closing the achievement gap for Indigenous students across our state, increasing opportunities to strengthen accountability for the success of Native students, and empowering communities through providing training, skill set building, and then creating containers of safety that actually revitalize and strengthen our Indigenous educator advocacy wellness, so we can sustain our work long term. And so, like I said, I'm trying to get as much into a concise nutshell as I can, but ultimately that's what we do. This year, actually, though, we're launching a brand new youth engagement strategy. In our efforts of the coalition, we informally convened in 2019, and our initial desire was to promote school choice legislation, and we did that alongside Senator Heiner. But what we found through that process was there was an unmet desire to have a safe space for our advocates to come together and discuss issues very vulnerably without fear of any negative implication that could result as a result of our vulnerability. We also found the consistent and active disengagement of tribal communities and nation to nation governmental relations. And so one thing that we're doing within the coalition that seeks to build a bridge or strengthen that is to provide more civic engagement education and exposure to our youth. And so when I say we're launching, we literally just hired someone last month, and we're in the process of convening a group of stakeholders to develop out that civic engagement strategy.
So if in light of that mission, let's back up a bit and talk about what's been missing in terms of Native American children's education. What are, or at least there are probably different things for different kids, but the big picture, what is it? What have you found are the missing pieces, the major missing pieces?
Well, I guess I'm going to quote, to the best of my ability, a statement that Senator Heiner made on the Senate floor during his last attempt at passing a school choice bill for Indigenous students. The thing that has been missing and has always been missing from Indian education is the Indian. And so that's a very loaded statement, meaning that at the very basic and foundational consultation level, there is little to no Indigenous representation at state decision-making tables that are influencing educational outcomes for our students. For example, Governor Noem's very first executive order in office, which was numbered Executive Order 2019-1, it effectively removed the Office of Indian Education from the South Dakota Department of Education and placed it under the South Dakota Department of Tribal Relations. There's a multitude of challenges that come with that transition. One of them, and one of the most foundational, is there's a lack of representation from our tribal education directors or our larger school districts at the Department of Education. And that yields some very problematic consequences. When we think about the consultation that happens with the TEDs, it's very minimal from the State Department. And it's really concerning because our TEDs are working diligently. They are expressing the greatest critical needs of our students, and they're an absent narrative from the fabric of the ed system. And quite frankly, our TEDs believe that movement was an act of segregation in our school systems in South Dakota. So that's like the ultimate overarching, I would say, overarching issue with our education system now.
And that, to recap, but to make sure I'm understanding you, that really basically says you're not consulted and your feelings and your needs are not addressed. Would that be correct?
Yes, 100%. I also think that the education system was a compulsory imposition on Indigenous people starting in 1868 with the founding of the first boarding school movement by Richard Henry Pratt. And since then, education has been one of the greatest tools of genocide for our communities, cultural genocide for our communities, but has also been the very means at which colonization sought to assimilate our people. Since it was compulsory and it was imposed on us, it was never designed to be in collaboration with us to create outcomes that were co-planned to yield prosperity for our communities. And so I think there were generations of fear and disengagement and frankly, parents not understanding their rights within the public ed system, which is perpetuated today. As we know, South Dakota has very limited school choice options, especially for students residing on reservations. And so not understanding your rights within a system or how to navigate those very systems of oppression create a perpetuation of problems that we see today.
Can you talk about some of the manifestations of those problems? In other words, well, how are our young people being affected by these lack of let's say consultation, lack of I would say caring about what they grow up to? How does that come out? What does it turn into?
Well, it equates to a school experience in which values reflected in the household are not also reinforced in the school setting. It also comes with the active disenfranchisement of students in classroom settings or in school spaces where they go in there seeking to find people who look like them or identity or leaders that reflect their cultural identities and affirm the legitimacy of those identities. And so I think that especially in our urban districts, we have students who are seeking to find that identity development, and not only are they in conflict with developing their own sense of identity in the world, but finding their grasp of their own indigeneity, but also trying to prove that to both their Indigenous and non-Indigenous peers. And that's a really critical challenge. When I talked about my story of going from a reservation student turned urban Indian advocate, it was actually in my time in Omaha that I realized quickly just how much students in urban centers are the odds are stacked against them for the reclamation of their identity, and it makes it even more challenging. And I think when you don't feel confident in who you are, where you come from, or where you're going, a lot of things feel uncertain in the world. And so not having the validation and affirmation of your own identity is a really critical piece of any human's development. And I think that speaks to the very nature of the importance of cultural affirmation in schools.
You know, it seems to me that it's one of the things that's very easy to forget, and that is that if we don't have that emotional support that we are somebody and that we count, a lot of the other things seem to be kind of just academic. You know, it's like it's hard to wade through that mud stream when you feel like everything around you is telling you that you're not important and what you feel is not important. And often that's as much about omission as commission. how that there's nothing there to say, yeah, you count too. And you don't have a sense that, cultures even outside of the US are presented before you as meaningful, but your culture and what you live is not presented as relevant. And I think that's easy to overlook how powerful a let's say disincentive that is to even show up at the school, let alone be a part of it. Let's then turn to your mission. What are the kinds of things that you're doing that you feel address those kinds of issues, the issues that you see?
Well, I think first and foremost, I want to come back to the coalition's definition a little bit, because when we say we're the coalition in true 100% form, we represent multiple agencies and individuals committed towards achieving Indigenous student success. So bearing that in mind, being collaborative and being constructively critical and being solutions oriented is something that our coalition has always prided itself in. I think in a most recent convening, we usually have 2 larger convenings that are held in person in addition to our weekly Zoom sessions. But at a very recent in-person convening, one of the elders in our coalition said that she sees the coalition as the Iapaha of Indian Ed. And that to me was a really humbling definition to hear, because it's like the MC of Indian Ed. We get to work in close proximity with key education leaders, making decisions and working on the ground to address unmet solutions. And I think we get to elevate the issue and share it with the right people. And that's really important to me. And I also think that being able to empower and create space for critical thinking and vulnerability is also equally important. I think one of the effects of historical trauma that we see today, especially as Indigenous professionals and a very small percentage of Indigenous education leaders, is just being siloed and feeling like the burden of responsibility resides on our shoulders. But this creates an entire contingency of support that some of us have never otherwise felt until the convening of the coalition. So I think creating that support to sustain the work is important. I think one thing that we're doing is normalizing and bringing into conversation, at least through a South Dakota lens, the importance of education advocates. I'm not discounting the greatest role that the direct service providers offer. So I'm talking about the staff, both certified and classified, who are working in schools in direct service for students. But there's also this unspoken reality about the role of an advocate and the key role that they play in the movement space. And I think that's something that we're able to normalize through conversation and convening, which has been really inspiring.
I would like to share with our audience that we know that I think we have an echo that's coming. Do you have like a radio or something that's going in your space, Sarah?
Yes, unfortunately, I'm calling in from a remote location today, so I don't have control of the noise around me. But I can lean in a little bit to see if that improves my audio.
Okay, all right. Just so long as we know we've done the best we can, then we'll continue. Okay, so one of the things that I've noticed that has really presented some challenges to young people, especially those who grow up on the res, is there seems to be sort of like a baseline feeling that I'm not good enough. I don't count. And even when there's a certain, sort of pushback to that, because someone has told them, hey, like you are somebody, and so they know that cognitively, but there seems to be something deeper in terms of actually believing it. It reminds me of in my childhood, James Brown came out with his song, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. And then a lot of people were saying it loud that they were Black and they're proud, and they were proud, but they didn't believe it, and you could tell that they didn't believe it. And you could tell that they didn't, even just the act of trying to prove it to other people, sort of an indication that you're really trying to prove it to yourself, and I'm not sure like that's even been dealt with yet. I don't, I mean, I can point to lots of things that suggest that it hasn't, but I noticed that in not only young people, but particularly when they've grown up on the res, but older adults too. It's like there's a certain sense of like that it has like really seeped into their very being. And I bring that up to ask, one, have you seen that too? And then two, is there something that is being worked on to deal with that?
Wow, that's a extremely loaded question today, and it feels deeply personal, and I say that because what you just described was the very nature of my path into this field. For example, in my mind, the very measure of ultimate success for me was the ability to move away from the reservation and never return. I left not even seeking or pursuing a profession in education. I left with hopes of becoming a dental hygienist. And it was actually in the classroom spaces alongside peers who were speaking about issues affecting my community, the very community where I grew up, with no knowledge through the lens of sheer stereotype. And I found myself unassumingly in this role of natural advocate there were times when I would speak to address some of the stereotypes and social perceptions that my peers had, not as the expert, but a person with a lived experience that would lend itself to the contrary of what they were saying. And I think I found a voice that had been silenced deep inside me, because to say that I was extremely proud of my indigeneity at that time in my life would be, I mean, it would be a far reality, and I'm reluctant to admit that now. I think it was through those experiences off the reservation that taught me a deeper sense of appreciation and the cultural affirmation that I received growing up on the reservation, but also a genuine appreciation and understanding for how the social implications of trauma actually manifest in life. And even when you think you're in control and you're making it, the insidious nature of trauma permeates every facet of life. So I remember, in fact, being in a senior capstone project talking about essentially assimilation and the desire to discard or demonstrate my ability to reinforce that I'm fully assimilated into this life and I can make it. And I'm not just going to make it because I'm not just an Indigenous leader, but I'm a leader, and I wanted to discard the indigeneity out of it. But I think in finding my voice, I was able to give voice to generations of those silence, but more importantly, give voice to my grandmas who were both buried without having knowledge of their language. They both were no longer practicing Lakota spiritualists. There were a lot of things about their lives that they did the best they could, but weren't reflective of the cultural safety that was needed for them to evidence true healing in this world. And so I would love to say today, I come before you extremely healed and affirmed. I'm still learning every single day, but I think that now what we're seeing and being in the coalition also affords me a unique opportunity to be among intergenerational leadership. So I'm able to hear from the elders and my predecessors who have been veterans in the field of Indigenous education advocacy, who have unfortunately hit more brick walls than I will have experienced to date. But I'm also honored and humbled to be alongside high school students with such resilience and determination in their leadership ability and the way that they stand in confidence in their being as young members of Ochati Shakowin tribes. And they are determined with that confidence to make change for themselves and their younger generations in ways that have taken me decades to achieve. So I'm inspired by both generations and their diligence and commitment to this effort. And I seek to find ways that I can continue to grow in healing and understanding of how that has affected my upbringing.
I appreciate that. I'm gonna take a break now to open it up to the rest of our esteemed panel here for any input, questions, interactions that you may have. Anybody?
I have a personal experience that I'd like to share. I always felt that the university was not something that I could go to. I was afraid of even going on a campus, never thought about it. I was out in California and was divorced with 2 children, but decided I wanted to do something that I loved. And so I got into the art department of a junior college because I knew I could succeed there. And there were no parameters to keep me out. It was open. So that's why junior colleges really take people like myself that didn't know that they could succeed, and it was open, no problems with grade, and it was financially cheap for me. So I strongly feel that you need to make it available to those who don't have confidence, that don't have the money, and never really saw themselves at the university level. But they do make it from junior colleges. You can transfer all your units to a 4-year university, which I did, and I went on. But I would never have gone to a university without that first step being available to me where I could succeed at something without all the restrictions that go on, along with university. And I don't know if there are junior colleges out here. But I think there needs to be a stepping stone for those that lack. I don't know how to say it. They just lack. They just can't see it at a university. There needs to be a smaller stepping stone to get them to the university for higher education.
Thank you, Vicki. Did you have any comment on that, Sarah?
No, thank you for your comments, Vicky. I will say that I agree with you that there needs to be alternative pathways that value the different levels of skill sets and talents that students uniquely bring to the table. I also think that when we think about Indigenous education, for instance, the metrics by which we're assessing student achievement are generally not in students of color's favor. I mean, we have students whose skill set in some culturally affirming things completely outweigh, and survival skills, frankly, completely outweigh anything that they can learn in the classroom. And that's a huge missed opportunity that we have in our system, and one of many missed opportunities that we have when we think about more inclusive and culturally proficient learning environments. But I thank you for your comments.
Go ahead, Sharon. Your mic's not on, Sharon.
Okay,
There.
thank you. Sarah, is there any way to counter the governor's move? I mean, has she really got the power to just take it out of one pot and put it in on another without any other input?
Thank you so much for that question, Sharon. And that has been our ongoing question. We have fought through the legislative attempts to reverse that action because it was an executive order. However, we have been denied that opportunity. I think writing more letters to our local lawmakers would strengthen that argument. I also think that when I think about this issue and all of the issues of the South Dakota Education Equity Coalition, one thing that I hope to impart on more people within our great state is that the burden of Indian education cannot lie exclusively on Indigenous shoulders. We all have to share responsibility in championing, frankly, public education for every single student. And when we have, in my mind, when we have an entire demographic that is underperforming, it is not the responsibility of the demographic, but the system to meet the needs that they're not meeting, to assist in the achievement of that entire demographic. Just like if we had an entire classroom of students and they were all failing a test, that's not a reflection of student ability, but rather teacher's ability at that moment.
I think you make some very important points, Sarah, about, and I think both Sharon and Vicky kind of leaned into it or brought it up, and that is, you know, the assessment by which we determine that people are ready to be functioning members of society may need an overhaul for everyone, you know. And you brought a very important point of survival skills. And I would include in that at the top of the list, interpersonal skills. And it would seem to me that if people don't have interpersonal skills, if those skills aren't honed, then the rest of it is not really a thing. You know, I mean, it's like if you teach someone how to all the science to know how to do biological warfare, then you should have already taught them why they should never do it. You know, I mean, it just would make sense. And it just seems to me that the metrics by which we measure people, not only in the school system, but overall, might need some work, which probably lies beyond the scope of your organization. But at the same time, I'm not sure how your mission can be as effective without those overall re-looking at, well, what are we measuring and how are we measuring people, and some of those basic questions.
Could I ask one question? What level of education are you going for? Is it to finish your high school diploma, or to go on to college or trade? I guess I just don't know.
Are you asking for my personal experience or as an organization?
Does a coalition aim for kids to get a college degree or a high school degree, or what type of education are you wanting to pursue for those that aren't getting it?
We seek to invest in culturally affirming pathways for student success. And the hope would be ultimately success in life. And you bring up a great question, Vicky, because one of our coalition stakeholders actually shed light on a really alarming fact that in one of the communities, and just due to confidentiality, I won't mention it where the community is located, but there was a survey conducted for parents and students in this specified community. And the results yielded the unfortunate reality that students right now, their perspective on what type of achievement they wanted for themselves was just to get through high school, to be able to say they graduated, and that was the form of success. And there was a hierarchy of those markers of success from the student perspective. And the first was graduate from high school. The second was to apply to a college, whether that was a university, a junior college, a community college, etc. But then if you flip that coin, and when we looked at the parent data, the unfortunate reality is that parents from this specific community stated that their number one goal, and this references and underscores the ongoing systemic and social challenge that Indigenous youth are faced with today, parents wanted their students to have life. They wanted their students to be alive, to even have a path. And to me, that, you know, as a parent myself to 4 sons, I mean, for me to say that my first responsibility was for them to have life was very limiting. And so we're in a social context, in an environment where many of our students are not having a long enough life to even see high school graduation, let alone a post-secondary pathway. And so I'm thinking about when Lawrence mentioned the metrics by which we're measuring success, it looks very different, and the priorities in our communities are very different. And it would seem natural that our local school districts and systems would reflect those needs that our communities deem to be important. And right now we have communities whose aspirations are simply for life for their kids, and that's a huge testament to what we're facing today.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it's really important what you just said, Sarah, because a lot of times things that we take in general for the society, we take for granted. For other people, that's a huge challenge, you know, just to know at the end of the, when your child is 18, they're still alive, that's a goal. You know, that's deep, you know. But it's interesting that a lot of children, even outside the res, have that same problem. And I see opportunities there for coalitions, because a lot of children face the same problems, but we try to pretend like, oh no, these kids are okay. They're not okay. There are a few of the kids that are okay, and we keep the spotlight on them to make it look like they represent all those other kids. But a lot of times, nope, they're not okay. And now they're starting to show up as meth addicts and all of the other kinds of things that go along with that. So I think, one, I see some potential coalition building, because, you know, if you can get people to see that, oh no, our problems are your problems. You may not see that, but you have a buy-in to make sure that we're okay, because making sure that we're okay is making sure that you're okay. You know, I think not enough people recognize that our destinies are woven together, whether we like the thread next to us or not. We're woven into the same fabric.
Mhm.
I would like to start talking about the kinds of things that you are doing to build those coalitions. You've created a coalition. Tell us about the kinds of things that you guys are doing that will address some of the issues that we've been talking about.
Yes, I would love to. Like I mentioned earlier, we are building the capacity for both professionals and community-based individuals to navigate systems. So for instance, helping communities understand federal funding streams aimed at improving Indigenous ed outcomes. Our Title VI Indian education grants are one example of those funding streams. And generally, on a national level, it's not exclusive to South Dakota. The ongoing challenge has been to get district buy-in. In order for those to maximize the effectiveness of those programs, they would need to be done in partnership with other funding streams. It's so far, just like the way that South Dakota views Indian education in a silo or in a vacuum, where Indigenous education should be led and promoted by exclusively Indigenous. That's kind of how the federal government is seeing it. These programs and services are aimed at it, but without, as Lawrence mentioned, the collaboration and the community work around it, it's left to something minimal, like a paper arts and crafts project. And I hate to minimize it to that extent, but that's the national challenge we're seeing. So on the ground level, we're making sure that there's a shared understanding among our coalition members of definitions, of language, of things that we feel passionate about, and that we all have the same understanding and vocabulary to express it, so it's on the consistent page. In South Dakota right now, the political climate is such that there's a lot of propaganda against efforts to diversify, make things more equitable or inclusive, and they're demonizing those type of words that seek to unify communities, which has been really problematic for us. Another challenge that we've been doing or that we've been navigating is the recent adoption of the social studies standards. That the adoption of those standards, just like the movement of the Office of Indian Ed, is extremely problematic to all students in South Dakota, not just our Native students. And it poses a real threat to the social outcomes of all of our communities across the state. And so it's something that, even though it's adopted, we don't believe that's an end. We don't believe that's an end game. We still believe there's time to navigate those systems. So we're working, part of our coalition strategy is to partner with organizations such as the ACLU. We also, like I mentioned earlier, work in close proximity with our tribal education directors and national partners to ensure that we're taking a comprehensive look at those decisions and weighing our outcomes and potential pathways to address those. So those are some of the things. We're also working on creating more partnerships with districts. We know that in our early years, districts were really resistant to collaborate with us, feeling threatened by our demand for school choice options. But now we're seeing an evolution, especially in light of the social studies standards process, of organizations and school districts that want to work with the coalition to enhance their levels of inclusion in their school system. And so that's really promising as well. I also want people to know that the coalition is not designed to tear down school districts. In fact, we're hoping to increase accountability to increase outcomes for all students, but especially our Indigenous students. And then we hope to also build relationships and provide education to lawmakers whose responsibility at decision-making tables is often extremely critical and impactful to the outcomes of our students. So those are just some of the strategies we're working on currently as we can continue building out our base and resources to continue our efforts.
I want to remind our esteemed panel here that in the chat, there we have been posting links and other kinds of notations relative to this program. And there's 3 little dots that you can click on, and then you can download those to your computer, so that after this program, should you want to follow up on any of the things that are linked to, you can do them without having to try to type all of that in while we're on the fly here. Before I go too far, one of the things I wanted to address was, how can I say, it gets back to the interpersonal relationships portion of this conversation. But I remember having a conversation with a good friend of mine, and her grandson, which she had nurtured, was able to get a scholarship to, I think, Dartmouth or something. Anyway, it was one of those Ivy League schools. He got a scholarship there, and he was a very good student, and just to spend all of his time like sitting in her living room doing his homework and getting help and stuff like that. So he was a very good student. Earned that place at Dartmouth, really, especially coming from the environment he was in. He got there, and after 1 semester, he came home. And the grandmother was like, well, why did you quit? And he said, it was too lonely,
Mm.
And, here he had been there, and he had the support of his grandmother and a few other people, but mostly it was, that kind of thing. But when he got there, the thing that he didn't have was the ability to be alone. Now, in one sense, you would say, well, okay, that's a good thing that you have that connection with your family, especially that family that really cares about you. But I'm wondering, like, how does one prepare for an opportunity? and I'm saying an opportunity in air quotes because we can discuss that on a whole other level. That said, it was clearly an opportunity for him because he actually applied. I mean, they don't just sort of come and drag you out like the boarding schools to go to Dartmouth, you know? So that meant that he had some interest, but he couldn't overcome the loneliness. It would seem to me that based on what we've been talking about, that's one of the critical things that even if you're successful, that if somehow we can't address that, that could be a stumbling block. Could you comment on that?
Yes, I think from my own personal experience, I can definitely relate to those feelings in my first couple of years being away. I think that one of the things that we're up against, it goes back to what we talked about with creating culturally affirming spaces for Indigenous students to thrive. I mean, you think about being so far removed from the familiar, without a system or a system of care in place. And then any type of sustaining practice that you would otherwise seek out at home is not available to you there. And so I think the spirit gets a little stirred in those moments, and when you feel like all hope is lost, you return to the center and where you're familiar. And so the answer, I really don't have the answer or the magic bullet to that question. I know that the spaces that we've seen the most success are the institutions that do their diligence to create spaces of safety and sustainability for Indigenous students. And when the students go knowing they have the system of care, the resources of care, they're more than likely to access those resources and remain. And that's what I would say to that, just initially.
So would you be able to, in terms of your organization, would you be able to like help a student to find those places, should they exist? I'm assuming that at least one or two exist, where, you know, and help them to understand that, hey, look, you know, like when you leave here, here's my personal experience, you can feel really lonely. And that can impact, even if you stay, it really is going to make doing the homework more difficult. And are there things you can do to help the student, let's say, to create relationships that, while they're not Indigenous, they can be supportive, because there's likely to be other foreign students, and essentially that's what you are as a foreign student. You know, there are other foreign students and other people who you might be able to create, let's say, your own, at least you can create your own tribe on campus, so to speak. You know, it's like, are there efforts to help the student to create their own new environment?
That's an amazing question and segues perfectly into one of the new efforts of our coalition. We've been talking a lot as a coalition about cultivating self-sustaining practices that would help lend itself to resilience in such adversity. I know in the advocacy space, it often feels like you're swimming against the current 100% of the time. And the efforts are arduous, they're tiring, they're physically demanding, but very much emotionally and mentally draining. And so we're tasked with the responsibility of determining the wellness practices that can be tried and true, and that we can share with members of our coalition, but that would also be inclusive of the youth that we work with. And so although we don't have the solution right now, the development of those practices is definitely an unmet need that even our adult advocates are feeling right now. And certainly something we're wishing to target moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So I'm going to open it up again to our esteemed panel here. Do you guys have any questions or comments?
I was thinking, I substituted at a school here in South Dakota, and I asked the students in high school level who was going to go abroad for any extra credit or study abroad, and no one raised their hand. And I was new to South Dakota again, and I found that the parents really didn't want the kids to leave home. So there was a cultural thing. They would rather have them on the farm and so forth. So my question is, on the reservation, poverty is definitely a factor, and parents are probably trying to survive, just make it through, and then they're hoping that their child just gets through high school, as you say. What is there any way to motivate the parents to encourage the child for higher education or more education when there's poverty hanging over their heads? Or is that a factor?
Well, I think that generally speaking, most parents want success for their children. Most parents have a desire for their children to do better than the generation prior to them. I think if you're operating in a state of constant survival mode, being able to forecast and plan effectively for a future is not something that you have the time or mental capacity to do all the time. I think about my own experience. My dad was a lifelong employee of the National Guard, and my mom was a teacher, but she didn't achieve her teaching degree until later in life after she had children, and she went through a community college setting. So when I first entered post-secondary education for the very first time, I was ill-equipped to navigate that space. So I think about Lawrence, that other students experience. We're often entering these spaces without having knowledge of what resources exist and are afforded to us on the campus. And since we've operated on paths in our life that made us a lot more independent or self-determined, or even through the lens of trauma, it makes us unable to ask or unable to you don't know what you don't know, is what I'm trying to say. And so there's a limitation on what you can do without having that adequate knowledge. And I'm not speaking for every student on the reservation. I'm merely sharing my experience, but also the limitations that living in survival mode can lend itself to.
Mm-hmm. Were you going to say something else, Vicky? I guess not. Well, one of the things that I've noticed too, that along with the loneliness, is a lot of students don't have, let's say, the knowledge to just kind of navigate the society. And a lot of it is that their parents don't have that, and no one that they know knows about those things. So like there, and of course nobody tests for it, because I think the system knows that nobody knows, and so they don't dare test for it, because so many people would fail the test. So again, I'm not saying I don't think that it's something that's limited to, let's say, kids coming off the res. I think it's a general thing, but it affects them even more if, because at least the places I've been to on the res, there's not a whole bunch of things that a kid could like look across the street and say, oh, I want to be that, or I wonder how that works. There's only a few things. I'm wondering, are there experiential things that people could do to give young people a bigger idea of what there is out there to be? I would add to that I discovered way late in life, after 3 careers, that there's this really thick book that the Department of Labor puts out that basically lists every known occupation in the United States. They even have numbers for them, and codified. Tells you like what kind of education you have to have, what the average pay is in various areas in the country, all these kind of information. And that book should have been sitting on every guidance counselor's out in their lobby for kids to be looking through before they ever get to the guidance counselor. But nobody ever tells a kid about that book, let alone, somebody taking the kid to the various factories and seeing how things work. I'm just wondering Could that be a thing for young people?
110%, Lawrence. I firmly and passionately believe that the best investment that we can make for the prosperity of all of our communities in South Dakota is in youth development. And so I always challenge individuals and organizations to provide direct service opportunities that create space for youth to explore things that are unknown and unfamiliar. We need more demographically reflective opportunities for students to access new professions, new spaces that are often underrepresented within our Indigenous communities across the state. A lot of the opportunities that I was afforded growing up were due to the generosity of organizations and philanthropic efforts that believed in the value of that investment, and I benefited immensely from it. I think we all have a unique opportunity in the spaces that we advocate in, whether that's our local congregation, any boards we serve on, the organizations or businesses that we work for, to call the question, what opportunities are we providing that are directly serving under-resourced youth? And how are we ensuring that those youth take advantage of the opportunities or even have knowledge of the opportunities? And so that's something that I would highly encourage. And as I mentioned before, we don't know what we don't know. And I think expanding youth horizons through creating opportunities is something that we all can do.
So I think that brings up a question for our last few minutes here. What are the kinds of things that the folks on this Zoom conference, as well as the folks in general, what are some of the things that they can do, and how can they hook up with you, or can they work, to help you put some wind in your sails to what you're trying to do?
Awesome question. I think one of the first things is you could reach out. You could definitely reach out. We have a website, SDHC.org. We also have a Facebook presence, and look at some of the priority areas that we've been working on. When we really need, there's a sense of urgency surrounding the return of the Office of Indian Education back to the South Dakota Department of Ed. So a nice phone call, letter, or email to your local elected official would serve us well in that regard. You could also email your letter of support for that movement to myself at sarah.white@sdehc.org. And I'm certainly happy to pass that along to the proper individuals. But we welcome a lot of, we welcome in-kind volunteer support, community support, and financial resources to help us grow in this effort. And then finally, if you haven't already, each of us lives within relatively close proximity to a tribal education director who's doing some phenomenal things, often on shoestring budgets, for the betterment of the students they're serving. So reaching out to them and identifying places within our local communities where we can lend assistance, that would be great. And then finally, always deferring to authentic, native-led, native-serving organizations that are doing work in the community. Anything that's serving the community is effectively serving our youth usually. So, but I emphasize the importance of seeking native-led, native-serving organizations.
Mm-hmm.
I would
So-
be really curious to know why you left or were fleeing the reservation. I know we don't have time, but I think that would really help people understand what's going on. I'll just cut it off there.
Well, I can answer it really quickly. My personal experience was, and desire to leave was primarily due to providing more opportunities for my family that didn't exist for me growing up, and having ample access to as many opportunities as I could access. And that was like the simplest way to sum up the reasons, but that would do it.
Yeah. I think a lot of those things can be boiled down to, there was, under this pyramid, there was a lot of reasons, but the big thing is I was trying to find a better way. And you don't see, I mean, if I know you can just drive through and see like the lack of opportunities on a reservation, just driving through it. And you go, you know, in other places, there's 20, 30, 40 different things you would see in the same spaces for a kid to see something that inspires them. And I think that each of us can reach out in some kind of way to inspire them. Again, I would point to our chat, and there's 3 little dots down it next to the smiley face that you can click on and download some of the links, and including Sarah's email that will help us to be able to connect and find some ways to not just talk about these things and use it as brain candy, but actually do something. Can we put some wind in the sails of what Sarah and her organization is trying to do? That kind of brings us to the end of our wonderful time here together. I want to thank all of you for joining in. A special thanks to Sarah for joining and sharing her efforts with it. And we will be in touch, Sarah, because I think I have a few resources for you, that things that I personally can do. And I want to thank again everyone else for joining us. And that will conclude our program. See you next time. Same time,
you.
same station.